Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm super excited to be here. We're talking about the weather in the chat. Um, Sorry, I got distracted. I'm super excited to be here with Jayne Ann Krentz, one of my very favorite authors. We were just talking about how I've been reading her for so many years. I'm sure you have as well. And Annelise Ryan, who is a mystery writer. And Jayne just came out with a new mystery book. So we're going to be talking mysteries tonight, but I think both books have some element of romance for all of us hard-headed romance readers. Oh, Arizona 70 degrees. Let's not talk about that. Um,
Rubbing it in.
Nice and yeah. So before we get started, just want to say a couple of things. One is I want to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I'd like to thank Jayne and Annalise for letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we just make magic. And that's how we get to do a lot of these great programs. You can buy signed books by Jayne and Annalise from our favorite local indie bookstore at Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link to that in the chat, as well as sending it out in an email after the program. And the way that we're doing this is Jayne and Annalise are going to talk for a little while and about their books and all of the exciting things going on in their lives. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A around the last 20 minutes. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. And if you just want to chat with each other, use the chat. I've always enjoyed following what's happening there. So really quickly, like I said, Jayne Ann Krentz is author of more than 50 New York Times bestsellers. She writes as Jane Castle and Amanda Quick. Amanda Quick is how I found her doing her historicals. Jane Castle writes sort of sci-fi, futuristic, sometimes mysteries, right, Jane? Yeah.
Always a murder. Always a murder. That's my theory. That's my plan.
Okay, well then that's what we have been enjoying. And then Annelise Ryan is USA Today bestselling author of multiple mystery series, including the Maddie Winston series. She's a retired nurse, and she now writes full-time from Wisconsin, her home in Wisconsin. And I have to say, her books are so atmospheric, and you can just feel Wisconsin. You can just feel like there's cheese in your veins when you're reading her books. So welcome, Annalise and Jane. Thank you so much for being here. It's going to be so much fun. And like I said, I'm going to go off screen, and you guys can talk about whatever you want for the next 40 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to take the lead here because I was telling them ahead of time that I have a whole page of questions for Miss Krentz because I feel like I am amongst publishing royalty here. I am a little bit in awe of even sharing a screen with Jayne Ann Krentz. And I just finished reading Shattering Dawn. It was fabulous, by the way,
Oh, thank
which is what, book three in your The Lost Night Files, right? Is that right? Yeah, the trilogy for the Lost Night Files. I have not read the first two, but I will definitely go back and read them. And I really enjoyed Shattering Dawn. It was great tension, great romance. Although I do have a question about your Gideon and your tendency to like alpha males, at least in the past when I used to read your books. I haven't read you for a little while, but I used to read you all the time back in the 80s. And I loved your male characters. Gideon I loved too, but I noticed there's a little bit of a shift in the way you wrote him. So I want to talk to you about that a little bit. Um, but I do want to say, first of all, that I was just looking up some of your history and saw that your first novel was actually published in 1979. And so I really do feel like I'm in the presence of literary royalty here. You've got over 120 published books. 50 of them have been on the New York Times, more than 50 on the New York Times bestseller list. You've got over 35 million copies in print. You're who I want to be when I grow up. So, I'm curious though about a couple things. I have pseudonyms. My real name is not Annelise Ryan. My real name, in case anyone's interested, is actually Beth Amos. That's my real name. And I had some books published under that name. And I have 20 books, I think it is, under Annelise Ryan. And I also have, oh no, maybe that's 14. No, it's 20. It's 20. And then I have 6 books published under even another pseudonym, Allison K. Abbott. And I know why I had to pick the pseudonyms, but you are the queen of pseudonyms because I found at least 7 of them for you. There is, let's see, Jayne Ann Krentz, Mostly contemporary. You write contemporary romance mostly under that name, I think. Jane Castle, which is your futuristic kind of bent, and also the Ghost Hunter series. Jane Taylor, Jane Bentley, Stephanie James, Amanda Glass, Amanda Quick. So, do you have trouble keeping track of who you are from day to day?
I would just like to say, for the record, that I didn't use a pseudonym, any of those pseudonyms for any other reason except because at one point or another I had crashed the career of the other one and I needed a new name. It's, this it is not a tale of clever marketing or brilliant strategy. Um, it's just that the business while I was coming up through the business, it was changing, and as you and I were talking about before the show, and evolving so rapidly, and the mergers were happening, um, and authors were jumping from one publisher to another in order to survive. But in those days when you did that, the custom was often to take a new name, simply because that was kind of how genre fiction worked. But in my case, it was usually because the publisher had gone down and took my career with it, the previous one. So I needed to find a new publisher, and that meant usually a new name. So if anybody out there is thinking about pseudonyms, I don't know about you, but my advice is don't go there. Just don't go there. And that's especially true in this day and age because um, it's so hard to brand 3 or 4 names. I mean, it's just not going to
Kidding.
happen. People just don't remember, do they? I mean, yes, it's always on the back of the book, but nobody reads the author bio. I mean, let's face it. And
And then there's the social media too. So you have an Instagram account under each name and a Facebook page for each name
don't do
and
it.
email accounts for each name, website. I mean, it's just a nightmare trying to keep up with it. And I only have three.
Yeah.
So
But I have to tell you before we go any further how much I love Death in the Dark Woods. I just love this character. I love the whole setup. This was absolutely
thank you.
brilliant. This is a cryptozoologist. I just love a monster hunter looking
Yes.
for the real monsters
Yep.
and usually solving a mystery along the way, right? Yeah.
Yep. The
Where'd you
dead
get
body,
the
as
idea?
long as there's dead bodies in there.
Yeah, yeah, well, we do depend on that. So where'd you get the idea? Was it something you'd worked with in the back of your head for a while or?
Well, kind of. It was actually the idea born out of finding out that Kensington didn't want to publish any more of my Maddie Winston books or the spin-off series that they had done off the Maddie Winston books. And they kind of forgot to tell me that. And when we found out about it, it was right before COVID, and I spent the entire year of COVID writing something completely different that I kind of had in the back of my head. And I kept telling my agent, "Oh, it's great! You're going to love it." And I gave him a few little hints, but didn't get into it in any detail. And when I finally got it done a year later, I turned it into him. Obviously, I write slower than you do. I turned it into him, and I eagerly waited his feedback. And he was like, "Yeah, there's a few things here I'm not crazy about." And so I said, "Okay, I'm used to editing." I went back and did a rewrite, and changed them, and sent it to him again. And yeah, there's a couple other things I'm not crazy about. So did it again, sent it back to him, and then he called me on the phone instead of emailing, and he said, "Look," he said, I hate to tell you this, but I really just hate this book. I hate this book. I don't think I can sell this book. I
Oh,
don't want to have anything to do with this book." And I said, "Okay, just stab me now, get it over with."
yeah.
And so he goes, "Come on, I know you can write. Let's brainstorm." So we brainstormed on the phone, and one of the questions he asked me was, "What are some of your favorite TV shows? What kind of TV shows do you like?" And the first thing out of my mouth was the X-Files. I loved the X-Files, and I've always loved woo-woo stuff, paranormal stuff. My first three novels that I had with HarperCollins that are under my real name were all Dean Koontzy kind of
Uh-huh.
paranormal novels. So I've always had a little bit of that woo-woo stuff in there too. And so we just got to brainstorming and we came up with the cryptozoologist idea and then also the weird little store that she has. He said, "If you can include a bookstore in here somehow, I can sell it tomorrow." And so we came up with a
I'm gonna remember
bookstore
that.
a bookstore slash oddities store because I'd seen one of those in New York City once and been through it, and I was fascinated with it. So that's how we came up with the idea. And it was interesting because talking to the editors at Berkeley, they wanted to know. the book that I wrote that he hated, I had set in Door County in Wisconsin here. And so I didn't want to waste all the research that I'd done for that. So I decided to set the first one of the Monster Hunter mysteries in Door County as well, and have it be a hunt for a Loch Ness type monster in Lake Michigan. And that's what I submitted to the editors. I did a quick synopsis and banged out 50 pages, and he sent it in, and they wanted to do a phone interview after that. So I'm on the phone with these editors, and they wanted to know where I planned to go after this. Was I going to stay in Wisconsin or go outside of Wisconsin for future books? And I said, well, I can stay in Wisconsin for quite a while because it turns out there's quite a few cryptids in Wisconsin. There's Bigfoot, and I explained that. I said, and then there's Rhinelander with the hodag, and they said, the what? And I could hear keys tapping in the background, and I said, well, if you Google it, and they went, my God, what's that? So anyway, that's how the whole thing came about. They loved the idea, and we've been running with it ever since. So third book comes out end of this month.
Well, I'm excited to read it because I love the whole setup.
I do.
The whole cryptozoologist. That's the first one.
Picture of it. This is
Oh,
no,
that's
this
the
is
new one.
actually this is the one that's coming out in January.
Okay, so this is number 2, and
That's
then
number 2.
and then one
Yeah, the
before.
first book has a much different cover. They did an interesting thing with the covers on this because this was the cover for the first one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
quite different. I like the new one. I like the later ones.
me too. Much better. In fact,
Yeah.
I hated this cover. Don't tell anybody, but I hated this cover.
I know they probably didn't know what to do with it. It was just something they hadn't done before, but somewhere along the line you found somebody who knew
Yeah.
how to pull up the imagery. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, see, your career isn't that much different than mine.
It's
Publisher.
been up and down and up and down and up and down. Yeah.
Every author I've ever talked to says that, it's nobody's had like a straight line up, at least none of the people I know. But
Yeah.
maybe that's how you survive in the business too. Is you have to be able to reinvent yourself, I think. It's
Yeah,
just
I agree with that.
yeah.
And come up with new ideas, which is one of my other questions for you. So after writing 120 books, because people ask me this all the time, I've written 28, I think now, so that I've had published. And so people always say, well, how do you keep coming up with ideas? And then I thought, my God, how does somebody that's written 120 plus books come up with new ideas and keep those plots fresh?
Well, I will say that having the 3 different careers, the historical and the futuristic and the contemporary, one huge advantage of that over my career span has been that it's very refreshing to go into one world and come out and go into another world. So even though I didn't do it intentionally, by accidentally setting up those 3 timelines or time zones or whatever, it turned out to be to my benefit. And the beauty of it is I can do plots in one world that would be impossible or just wouldn't ring true in another world. So it gave me, I get more variety in the plots. But all that said, certain things are always going to be there. I always do basically a murder mystery. And while I use the psychic thing a lot, I love the psychic thing. For those out there who are looking at paranormal is often defined, I think you'll agree, by vampires and werewolves and shapeshifters and witches. That seems to be what when people say paranormal. But I do the psychic thing. So in a sense, there's no supernatural. I look at the psychic thing as a step beyond intuition. And everybody thinks they have intuition. And so it's easier to make that step, I guess. And I like the way you can use it for bonding. All that said, the psychic thing is kind of what I'm leaning on heavily now, and that's given me some new directions. And also, I'm just older, so the stories change, but I will say, if you go back to the beginning of my career, certain emotional conflicts and elements have been there from the beginning. When I look back, the core story, I think of it as every author having a core story, and they spend their careers exploring it in a way, and I always feel like the core story is founded on some kind of emotional conflict that draws the author, that they want to work through again and again. For me, it's always been trust, Trust is always an issue in my books, and reinvention. My characters are always in the process of reinventing themselves. And you've got a lot of reinvention going on in this, so don't tell me you don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, I don't think you can be an author and not know about reinvention because it's part of trying to get through this industry. But back to the psychic things, because I'm intrigued. My first novel was actually, like I was telling you earlier, kind of a Dean Koontzy thing, and it was about a young boy who, as a baby, is involved in an explosion, an accident, and unbeknownst to anybody, this hot sliver of metal gets driven into his brain through the soft spot, and it stimulates a part of his brain that gives him psychic powers as he gets older. And his father dies in the crash. This is all in the first chapter, so I'm not giving anything away. And he ends up being able to speak to his dead father, and certain things evolve because of that. And then the second book that I had was also a little bit woo-woo and psychic, but it was a little more about organ stealing and transplants and stuff. You know, I nurse, you write what you know. But then the third book, my character gets blinded in an explosion, and she has an experimental surgery done to try to restore her eyesight, a surgery which actually was created about 10 years later. So I was pretty proud of that one. But she can't see clearly, but she sees auras. And so when I was reading your book here, when I was reading what Amelia was seeing with the auras and the kind of the footprints and stuff, and in my character, she can interpret things through the tumultuousness of the aura, the color of the aura, and just the general feel of it. And that's always been something that attracts me. And I wish I was psychic, but I'm not. So I'm curious about whether or not you are psychic. Do you
Oh,
think you're psychic?
no. I think
No.
like everybody else, I've got some degree of intuition, but I don't consider it psychic level, and I usually ignore it anyway, so it's not
So what got
terribly.
you so intrigued in the psychic part of things?
Um, I think well, I grew up on comic books. So, there's a kind of a out there thing anyway. Comic books and Nancy Drew were my foundational reading.
Yeah.
Um, but I loved working with the psychic thing because it gave a depth to the relationship. They kind of my hero and heroine usually recognize that deeper element in each other, and that bonds them in a way, allows them to communicate in a way that um, is less superficial than maybe the relationship would be otherwise. And I just like the psychic thing because it gives me plots where I don't have to use the cops. I do
Ah,
I do not have to solve the crime using DNA and forensics and you know the real work of crime solving, about which I know very little except what I see on TV.
yeah, I
And
love all that stuff.
well, I don't want to be tied to it.
Oh
You
yeah, it's difficult. It requires a lot of homework.
and you did that because in this one, in Death in the Dark Woods, you're dealing with the fine lines of distinction between local police forces and what they can do, and what the rangers in the parks, whose job is what. And you have to know what you're doing to write that and to make the book feel real. But that's what makes this feel so real. So
Yeah, the fun part of that though is getting to is contacting people who work in those fields, and they're always, it seems like, eager to work with you and share what they do with you and tell you things. And it's a lot of fun to spend time with people who work in law enforcement or spend time with the rangers, and learning about other people's occupations. The medical stuff I kind of know just from having been a nurse for 50 years. I learned a lot of medicine and science. In fact, I tell people my last 20 years was as an ER nurse. So I always tell people that the reason for my pseudonyms is because I didn't want my patients to know I spent my spare time thinking of fun ways to kill people. But that's not really the reason for them. But the science part of it, I've been drawn to science, and I'm a very scientific person. And yet I want to believe in the psychic stuff. I want to believe in Bigfoot and Loch Ness and the Hodag. And so my character, Morgan's a lot like me in that regard, is she can't forego the scientific, absence of proof, I guess, but she believes in the plausible existability, as it's called in there. So that science part of it, and the science part of it for yours, I know your space, you have books, you have romance taking place in space, you have romance on every imaginable place on the earth and in space. What's your interest? Because you have quite a few futuristic things. What's your interest in space? Does that have a connection with your husband? Because I think I read somewhere that your husband was a retired aeronautic engineer.
Engineer, yeah. Electrical, but the electrical was aeronautic, electrical, electronics and stuff.
Uh,
But that's not, I think it was because I'm of that generation that watched him walk on the moon.
uh, where were
And
you when that happened?
yeah, I was waiting tables in a restaurant. I was just a kid. And everybody stopped and watched on TV. And it was just, and also Star Trek was out there.
Yeah,
I think I just kind of got raised on it. And science fiction was one of my great loves in high school. And
mine too.
yeah,
Yeah, I was on one of the mountains in the Olympic mountain range, actually, with a group from our church doing a hike with a bunch of teenagers watching. We were watching and listening on a transistor radio when man walked on the moon.
it was pretty
And it was
dang exciting.
quite an experience. Yeah,
Yeah, it was. I think it marks you for life. It probably.
it does. It's one of those moments you never forget for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I'm curious too about speaking about all the places that you write about. You write. I mean, you've got a lot of locations in your books, and I haven't read all of them, so I don't even know what all the locations are. But I'm just curious if you have. Do you visit all of your locations, and do you have like a favorite location that you've written about?
Well, if you look, if you actually look at my books, I'm always on the West Coast.
Right,
Occasionally,
what
I
you know.
stray over into Arizona, but basically, that's the territory I know, and I don't like to do a lot of research on locations, so I kind of stick with what I know. Um, so it's just I suck at writing scenery, green trees, nice water. I just
Blue skies or not? Yeah,
yeah, I don't know
yeah.
what to say. It's raining, it's not raining. I just don't have that gift for atmosphere. One of the reasons I absolutely adore the Gothic, I consider it the foundational text for romantic suspense, which is what I've always loved to read. And um, and yet I've never really written a full-on Gothic. And the reason is because it does require description. Like
Hmm.
kind that you can do. You could write the Gothic because you've got that natural voice for description. And that story really needs that, the classic Gothic. Um, and I mention it because it's kind of been hot again.
Is it?
Yeah, I've seen more and more of it out there, and I'm not sure how big it will always go, because it is kind of a thing. But yeah, and I was talking to other people about what it is that defines the Gothic and what draws, me, because it's like I said, I consider it a foundational story. And I realized that always and we all borrow from it in a sense because we always try to put our heroines in a sense of a place where she's on her own, that sooner or later she's responsible for saving herself. And there's always that question of trust. Who can she trust in this world that she's confined to? And in your case, you pull on it in a way because there's always that element of what can I believe? Am I seeing things, or am I going mad? That's the ultimate kind of Gothic thing. But questioning what your eyes are, what you're seeing is also part of that Gothic heritage that I think that we all pull on to some.
Yeah, and also the moody brooding male presence there, which brings me back around to that question about your male characters, because I might be misremembering, because it was, like I said, I've read most of your books back in the 80s, and I remember you seem to have a knack for writing nice, strong alpha males, which I confess I like. I know all the feminists out there are going, oh my God, but I kind of like that in my fiction, even if I don't like it necessarily in real life. But
You know
I
why? You
sensed
know
in,
why? I can tell you why we respond to it. It's because it's fundamentally they're heroes and they embody the classic heroic virtues. They've
Yeah,
got
that could
honor,
be.
they've got integrity, they've got determination. You can trust them to be there until the end. And that's a hero. And that's the ultimate alpha male. So
Well,
in
in Shattering Dawn, your male character Gideon I was a little surprised that he was softer than I remember your male characters being in the past, only because I mean, he was still kind of brooding and moody, like good male characters often are, but he had the injury that sort of limited what he could do physically, so walking with a cane, and he was willing to subjugate himself to Amelia quite a bit. I mean, let her make the decisions and do what she was telling him to do. And I liked that about him. I mean, he protested a couple of times, but then he was like, all right, I'll give it a try. And like, okay, I admit you know what you're talking about here. So I just wondered, do you feel like you've softened your perspective? Is it just this one book, or is that something that's kind of evolved in your books?
I think it's just kind of evolved in my books because more and more I would say that at the start of my career, I was doing almost more of a forced or a what do they call it? A marriage of convenience kind of story. In which especially in the historicals, in which basically the hero psychologically and socially outranks the heroine, in that sense, has more power. And so she has to equalize that situation before the book can end. Um, Now, when I come into the story, the characters are already kind of on an equal playing field, and they see the hero in each other in a sense. They see the strength, and they see the smarts, and they see the determination, and they start out not knowing each other, but that's what they discover about each other, and that's what makes the relationships work for me. Um,
And
I've never
society's norms have kind of evolved that way too, to equalize the sexes a little bit in regards to that and the way they're portrayed or the way we think of people supposedly. I mean, I think our generation is a little more old school in that kind of stuff, but the new modern younger generations, I hate aging myself, but yeah, I think they have a different outlook on the male-female relationship,
oh
if it's
yeah,
even male-female.
yeah,
But and didn't one of your books have I think it was yours. I might be remembering this one wrong, but wasn't there one that took place like in one of the future books that had people who were given a spouse or paired up automatically with somebody they didn't get to choose? Was that one of your books, or am I thinking about somebody
yeah.
else?
I think that's somebody else. Yeah. I
Okay.
don't, I have never done it that full on where usually my people are in a situation where they need each other to survive. They're thrown into danger and they have to learn to trust each other if they're going to survive because they're both going to have to work the problem together. So I think of them as starting out as unwilling allies or allies with an edge. They're not sure how far, but their goals are aligned for this immediate project of survival. So they can trust each other that far. And then in the process of solving that crime or surviving the threat, that's when they see the full range of each other's personalities and character. And that's where the love comes from.
And does
Um,
that always involve sex in all your books?
yeah, I've always done that romantic relationship. Yeah. I I think if I were going to I don't know. How about you? Have you always had a romantic relationship going on in the background?
Much,
Or
pretty much. Yeah.
because
I
people
tend to make it a little more off the page. My first book had a sex scene in it that was pretty vivid, but and blatant, but I don't think any of my others have. So, but it's certainly suggested. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
they're obviously having sex, but yeah, it's not on the page.
yeah.
I
No,
got
that's
branded kind of as a cozy mystery writer, so when that happens, you have to,
real
roll
sex.
back the swear words and roll back the sex on the page, and so I have a lot of sexual innuendo. In fact, I kind of go over the line of cozy a lot of the time because I've never really thought of myself as a cozy writer. But I do try to rein it in a little bit for that reason.
Well,
So
in Death in the Dark Woods, it's certainly got the murder side of it, the suspense side of it is quite grisly.
just the first chapter.
Just okay.
Yeah, the grisly stuff usually happens in the beginning, and the rest of it's not too horrible, but
okay.
yeah.
But you're okay with that.
I'm fine with it, and the publisher was
classic.
fine with it too. So
Yeah, good. Because you're kind of redefining the cozy is what you're doing. If you're going to
yeah,
call
I
it
don't think
cozy.
these books are considered quite so much. I don't think the publisher thinks of them quite so much as cozies. All my books with Kensington, the Maddie Winston books, it's a nurse who goes to work for a coroner in Wisconsin. So there's autopsy scenes. So it can only be so cozy when you've got autopsy scenes. And she cusses like I do. Sometimes I didn't even realize she was cussing. It just kind of flows out onto the page. And then I find it later. And there's definitely a lot of sexual innuendo in those books. So I
That's
don't
not
really think of them as cozies, but they tried to brand me that way, at least for the
uh,
first half of the series. And I think they kind of switched because they changed my covers, they changed my titles, they changed everything about halfway through. I think when they realized they weren't going to be able to wrangle me into the cozy community, and I got much better covers after that. I didn't not to knock the puppies and kittens on covers, but I really was not
yeah.
crazy about having covers with puppies and kittens on them. So.
No, I think that was not a good way to define your audience or to define the covers for the audience. It's because you are not writing the straight up cozy at all. It's
No,
it's
no.
it's a mystery novel, and it's just you've got a really fascinating. The nurse makes a fascinating protagonist, and the cryptozoologist makes a fascinating. They're not the typical amateur sleuth, I guess,
Yeah,
is what I'm.
the series I wrote under my other pseudonym of Allison K. Abbott, those initials were intentional because I didn't want to have to do another pseudonym. So I got AKA in there. She's a bartender. She owns a bar in Milwaukee. So that one was a little bit different for me to write. But again, she had some woo-woo powers that I discovered when I was writing one of my other books, the one where the lady who sees auras. I came across a disorder called synesthesia where
Yeah.
your senses kind of get cross-wired. And so people, and it's a real disorder. A lot of people have it, musicians in particular. Like I know Billy Joel is someone who has it. But you basically, like, they hear their music, but they also see it. They might see it as colors, or they might see it as numbers or letters, and that's how they know when the music is right, because the numbers and the letters or the colors all come together right. And so my character has a very magnified version of that, and she uses that to kind of help her solve the crimes that happen, the murders
But
that
I love
happen.
it. That's
And
right up
and
my
they wanted
alley.
drink recipes to put in the back, and so I had great research assistants to help me with coming up with the drink recipes, and we had a lot of fun with that part of it. So
The research must have been entertaining, if nothing.
no, it was.
Now, well, that's what people are looking for in the classic in the mystery genre. They want the sleuth that surprises them. Somebody that is just outside the box and solves the crime in a way that's outside the box. I think there's just
Yeah,
something.
and something different, which gets harder and harder to come up with all the time, I think, because people are very, very creative, and there's so many books out there now. Um,
Well,
so
I gotta tell you, when I went into when I decided to go full on into the psychic thing, which um started, I guess, back with the Fog Lake books a few years ago. Um, I kind of knew about the fact that the US government had been heavily involved in psychic. Everybody kind of knows that there was a lot of paranormal research going on. But oh my gosh. There is no telling how many billions of dollars went down that rabbit hole.
no kidding.
The CIA
And
and everybody, and
and
big,
conspiracy theories still about all that stuff too.
yeah, and big schools like Duke were involved in quote unquote serious paranormal research, and the CIA was into it, and it's just there's no shortage of plots. Um, that's for dang sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, what's your writing process? Like, what's a day in your writing life look like?
chaos. It supposedly starts out at, I get up early. I'm one of those annoying morning people. Um, and my greatest creativity usually comes in the morning. I mean, if I whatever creativity I've got for the day, that's when it's going to show up, is in the morning. And my biggest problem is I don't I'm lousy at, I start out with an outline, but I'm lousy at following it. It just changes on me all do you have that problem? Is that
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have yet to write a book that actually followed the original synopsis that I turned in. It doesn't happen. Even who the killer is in the end
yeah,
often changes.
same here.
And
Same
the
here.
fun part about that is that a lot of times I'll get to the end of the book and realize, wait a minute, it's not that person, it's this person who committed the crime. And so then I go back to edit and kind of put in some clues to make it, play fair with the readers. And I realize the clues are already there. So some part of my brain knew who the killer was all along, while the other
Psychic.
part was trying to force it into something else.
So
So
maybe there's
yeah,
a psychic element involved there because
maybe.
I go through the same process and I here's what I think is really going on is that what happens is our greatest creativity happens when we're actually creating on the page. The very act of creating, I think, stimulates creativity in a way that when you're sitting back and just trying to outline things, it doesn't, the brain works differently.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I-
I agree.
so you kind of have to be in the zone to get the good ideas, unfortunately. It'd be nice to have
To
a,
talk about the plotters and the pantsers, but I think a lot of writers like me and you, I guess, are both. You're a combination of both. You kind of plot it out in the beginning, but then you go by the seat of your pants for the rest of it. I mean, and if it doesn't come out like your original outline, so that's fine. And I've
no,
always been worried that my editors would say, "Wait a minute, this isn't what you turned in." And so far, that's not been a problem. Knock on wood. So.
I think they're just looking for a good story, and if it works, they're not going to question how you got there.
Yeah.
So
So talk a little bit about libraries, because one thing that you and I were talking about beforehand, we both have a very deep respect for and appreciation for libraries. And for me, I know that growing up, my dad, every time he got promoted, it meant to move. So I was the new kid in school, a lot of places. I managed to go to high school all in one place, but all through grade school, I was the new kid. And I was also 5'10" over, taller than all the boys and all the girls. And I had extra wide feet and had to wear stride right shoes. So I was this gawky, awkward, goofy looking. I had cat eye glasses that were always crooked on my eyes and on my face. And so it was hard to kind of, mix in with people, which is where I think I learned how to write, because I learned how to make up stories about my life and myself to make me sound more interesting than I really was. And my mom called it lying, but I think it was just preparation for becoming a writer. But libraries helped keep me sane during all that, because I could go to a library, I could get a book, and I could just lose myself in whatever journey that book took me on. And I really have a deep, deep debt of gratitude to libraries for that. And I did read an interesting quote about you. You said you have a graduate degree in library science, is that right?
I have a
Yeah.
master's in library science. Yeah.
And so you had a job in the Virgin Islands. One of your first jobs was as an elementary school librarian
Oh,
in the Virgin Islands. And I think that you said that was wait a minute, where is the quote? An unmitigated career disaster. What was that about?
well, it certainly left me with a respect for teachers. I'll tell you that. It's one thing to be a librarian. It's another thing to be a children's librarian because you have to be a teacher as well as a librarian. I had the library skills. I did not have the teaching skills. And but I worked with some people who did. And it was when you see that talent in action, it is awe-inspiring. As far as I'm concerned, if you find a natural born teacher, someone who's got the talent, pay them CEO salaries and give them whatever they want. It's
Absolutely, we should.
it's absolutely the most it's just the most incredible gift that you can have is to have that magical teacher. And the more of them, the better. And but I came away realizing yes, you can educate to a certain extent, but there's something beyond that, that there's something charismatic about a real teacher. And the kids respond to it, everybody responds to it, and that's who we should be recruiting into teaching.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. Because, a lot of teachers in my background made a big difference in my life too. So, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I know that Mina told us that we should go until about 7:40 her time, and looks like it's right around that.
And
Oh,
there's
there she is.
You guys are very punctual. I appreciate that. So people in the chat are really loving hearing some Jayne lore about your time as a librarian in the Virgin Islands. They also want to know, when are we getting more dust bunnies
oh,
from that was
yeah.
people in glass houses, right?
Yeah, June would be the next book out. And I drive, of course, a blank on the title.
I don't know why after 120 books. Come on.
And usually the titles aren't mine anyway. Usually it's something the editor came up with because I suck at titles too. So yeah, but there's a book in June, early June with a dust bunny. And I would just like to say that those dust bunnies have taken over my entire Jane Castle career. And I have this vision that on my grave there's going to be this headstone that reads, "She wrote the dust bunny books." That's what
Well, Kelly, one of our audience members, looked it up and says it takes a psychic.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
I'm
There you go.
Well, I mean, Shattering Dawn just came out. How many books do you usually put out a year, Jayne?
Now these days two.
Two. Oh no, just two.
Well, it keeps me off the streets. So
Oh well, that maybe is good for, I don't know, young children around your neighborhood, but not for us. Okay, so I have to ask you because Annelise had asked you about or talked about branding and how her publisher really kind of, tried to get her a cozy mystery. Do you have a brand, Jayne? Because like there's no way to put you in a box. Like there's no way to say Jayne writes mysteries, Jayne writes romances, Jayne writes paranormal. So what do you consider yourself?
absolutely at romantic suspense. That's from the start of my career. And I define that as a genre unto itself. And I define it by saying that every twist in the romance affects the plot, and every twist in the suspense affects the romance.
Ooh.
That's romantic suspense. You could not remove either element and have a story left.
Mhm.
And
So it doesn't really matter in some ways the time period. So it could be a historical, it could be a sci-fi, but it's always a romantic suspense.
that's what I write. That's part of my core story. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that really puts it together for me.
I've
Okay.
had time to think about this.
Yes, 120 books worth of time. But so Nancy asked this really interesting question. She said, well, starts off with, "Hi, thanks so much for chatting with us. I'm a huge fan. The Waiting Game was the first romance book I ever read and got me hooked. If you had 5 minutes with your younger self when you first started publishing, what writing advice would you give to her?" And Annelise, I'm going to start with you with that question. What would you tell yourself if you were just starting out again?
Oh my God, I sent my very first short story out when I was 17 years old, and I spent the better part of almost 2 decades trying to write short fiction and get it published. So I probably would tell myself to not take the easy route and go for the short stuff, to try, not be afraid to try the novel length work, because that's where I finally found my niche, was in writing novel length stuff.
Mhm.
And I
So
would just say, don't go for the pen names. Just try and find one name and stick with it.
Good luck with that.
You'll be very sorry about all those pen names.
I mean, I guess I feel like it sounds like it's a bit of a hassle for you, Jayne, but like for me, it's like a defining character of yours, like that I know if I pick up an Amanda Quick, it's going to be historical. If I know, so like you had mentioned that nobody really pays attention to it, but I think for you, people really do.
Oh, well, I do think that the names do identify my three worlds, and that's useful in a lot of ways if you can remember them. Because people, I tell me if you think this is true, Annalise, but in my experience, the fictional landscape is very important to the reader. a lot of people will not read a historical mystery. They only want a contemporary mystery.
Mm.
A lot of romance readers don't read historicals, they want contemporary or vice versa. Um, and within the suspense genre, for example, it gets siloed too because people who read British police procedurals often don't care about American police procedurals. And the definition, of course, is that in the British police procedural, the cops are the good guys.
Right, right.
Um,
But yeah,
because
it's interesting with the British. I was just want to say that British police procedural mysteries is one of my favorite things to watch on streaming TV. I hate
yeah,
to read the books.
in
And
that
there's not very many things that are like that. Generally, anything I like to read, I would also like to see, done turned into a movie, a show, or whatever. But the few British police God, I can't even say it, procedurals that I've tried to read, I don't know, they kind of bored me, and yet I love watching them on TV, the streaming shows.
Mm.
well, I just think the fictional landscape is more important than most writers realize and most readers realize. It's just unconscious to, I'm not going to pick up a historical novel, period, or I'm not going to pick up this kind of book or that kind of book. And it's not to do with the characters of the story, it's to do with the landscape.
Mm.
Um,
I would slightly disagree only in that if I find an author I really like, I'll read everything by them. So it doesn't matter to me if they write a historical or a science fiction or whatever. I just want to, I love that person's writing. And I know,
my readers often won't go across.
Yeah, and I've found too that like the fans of my Maddie Winston books will have picked up the Monster Hunter mysteries and they're really disappointed because it doesn't have the humor. The Maddie Winston books are quite funny. There's a lot of humor in those books, and the Monster Hunter mysteries, I mean, there's occasional humor, but that's not one of the main things about those books. And even though they're written by the same person, the same author, I've had quite a few people say, "Oh, I was expecting more of the same kind of humor stuff, and these don't have that." So I think they get an expectation based on what they've read of an author beforehand. It's kind of like when Mary Stewart, talking back to Gothic romances, when Mary Stewart deviated and did her Merlin books, I was pissed off because she was one of my favorite Gothic romance writers.
I
And
didn't
I was
read
like, what is
them.
she doing? And then I went ahead and I read the first Merlin book and I was totally hooked and I read it all. So, sometimes you just got to wade in and give it a try. But my expectation was, I was just like, the woman's lost her mind. What's she doing? How could she do this to me?
I know. I know the feeling. We've all had that. So,
okay, so Susan asks, when you write your plots, do you think about what your audience would like to see or what you would like to see happen? Jayne?
I have to write the books first for myself. If I'm not into them and excited by them, nobody else is going to be able to get into them. I can only tell the story my way and then hope like heck that other people can step into the fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Annelise?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think if I'm not entertained by it and if I can enjoy it, if I'm not engrossed in where I am and who the characters are and what's going on as I'm writing, and then the readers won't be either. So I have to write to please myself first.
Mm-hmm. Do your characters talk to you? Do you hear them in your head telling you what to do?
It's not bad enough that we have multiple names that we have to keep track of. Now you want to know if we hear voices in our heads. So I'm always a little leery to answer that question. So no, they don't really talk to me, but sometimes it's like I was saying before with when you know the killer ahead of time, you're writing your book, and then all of a sudden you get to a point and you go, wait a minute, it's not that person, it's this person. And you go back and you find out that those clues are already there. My subconscious, I think, a lot of times my characters manipulate my subconscious and send them in directions that I don't anticipate them going in. But I can't say that they've actually talked to me. I've never heard their voices or anything. And I'm sticking to that story. My psychiatrist said I had to. So
I don't hear them so much, but I do when I start writing dialogue, and I'm a very dialogue driven writer because I can't do this description. So 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 for me the story starts working when people start talking to each other. Either the bad guy is talking to somebody or the characters, the hero and the heroine are talking. That conversation is what gives me their personalities and shapes the story for me. So in a sense, I guess I do hear them.
Have you had any feedback at all, Jane, about dialogue for your characters? Your characters tend to be in their 30s, late 20s, 30s,
Yeah.
somewhere in that age range.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much where most of the characters that I write are also. But I've had some people tell me that my dialogue, that the character's supposed to be in their 30s, but the dialogue sounds like somebody much older. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, because I am a lot older. But and I don't know if it, if it's just because I'm not picking up I spent this week of Christmas with my 28-year-old niece and listening to her talk and the jargon that they use and the little abbreviated words. And I'm thinking, okay, I kind of get that. But I don't think I'm hang around people that age enough to be able to incorporate it into my writing. And I'm not sure I would want to. I'm just curious if you've had any kind of feedback like that.
I don't try to go for the modern, whatever the current act, what is the
Dialect or yeah, I know what
dialect
you mean.
is. Yeah, I don't go for that either. And for one thing, it will forever anchor the story.
Hmm,
And
good
one thing
point.
I learned early on is you don't want to tie it to current events if you can avoid it. You don't want to tie it to cell phones. I mean, that was a bad moment for all of us when we came into the cell phone age, and all of a sudden that changes all
Yeah.
our. But the same I think is true of language. It will really pick if you want to anchor it in a time and place, then you probably better research it. If you want to do a book set in the 60s, you'd want to go back and read some of the writing and what was happening or listen to the movies. The movies is probably the best way to pick it up from any one era. But I think it's kind of a mistake. I like a more universal story. And
That's a good point. And I think speaking of writing in eras, Sue Grafton, I think, was brilliant to put Kinsey Milhone in the late 80s before cell phones and all the DNA and all that stuff became available because it made for a much easier, I shouldn't say easier, but it made the job of a PI a little less complicated. You didn't have to worry about DNA and cell phones and GPS and all that kind of stuff. So
we're going to see more of that. I think I read something the other day, a gothic-y sort of story, and it was set in the early 90s just to avoid certain.
that,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So
I spoke to another author who wrote Romantic Suspense a couple years ago, and she said that it's really hard to find ways for people to not communicate now. So like, when you're trying to build suspense and you know that if you just picked up your cell phone, you could call for help. So all the cell phone towers are down or, huge storm and things like that. So are you finding that as well as you write your mysteries and your in your romantic suspenses?
yeah, yeah. There's still places you can go, like the big dark woods,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
where you
Yeah,
are
there,
cut
there was
off.
no cell service out there. I can promise you that. And the book I'm working on now with the is the Beast of Bray Road, and that takes place down in a town here in Wisconsin, close to Chicago. So there's pretty good cell service, but out on the road where I wanted most of the action to take place, I needed there to not be cell service. And so we were walking around out there in these woods and fields, my husband and I going, oh crap, can't do it here. There's cell service. And I'll go, oh, hey, one bar. Maybe if we go this way, we can run, trying to find the spot that doesn't have cell service because I needed that for my plot.
That's true research there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of ticked off a farmer because we were walking through his field, but at least it wasn't during planting time. So
But isn't that, I mean, for Jane, like the most interesting thing in some ways of writing like having paranormal elements or sci-fi elements is that you really can make up anything.
yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm looking to solve the crime without using police procedural techniques and technology. Um,
Mhm.
so my characters can walk into a room and know a murder took place there, but there's no physical evidence that would make it obvious that something happened. But they get to know it because of their sensitivities. So
Okay, so Gay asks, when will we see a new Amanda Quick Burning Cove book, Jane?
I've kind of stopped that. the Burning Cove books were set in the 1930s. It was the first time I had left the 19th century with Amanda Quick. Um, I liked the 1930s, but even within that decade, I was really working with a very narrow time span of 2 or 3 years. And I kind of ran out of stories because I was tied to the events of the time. And so the books sort of take place right after Amelia Earhart disappears, but before Wizard of Oz. So, um, and after a while, it kind of I lost. I mean, I might be able to go back and do stories, but I nothing was coming to mind. I learned a lot from going back to that era, which is before my time. I would just like to point that out.
Thanks.
Way um, but and the other thing I did was make sure it was set on the West Coast because I wanted the glamour factor from Hollywood.
Mhm.
I was pulling on what the movies pull on, okay, not the reality. But one of the things I learned doing that is that, I mean, I guess I always knew it, but because I've been doing it all along, we all do. But every era has its own myths. It has several myths, more than one. So you can have a very dark noir story coming out of the 1930s. You can have a pre-war story coming out of the 1930s. You can have the Depression I mean, but you've also got this glamour side from Hollywood, um, and what authors do, I think, is choose their myth, choose the one they're going to work with. When you pick a historical setting, and that's what you lean on,
Mhm.
just to make the book work. And
I admire anybody who can write a historical anything because that just requires so much back checking and homework. And I know I would totally screw it up. I'd have anachronisms all over the place. And that's like my biggest fear is that the readers are going to call me out and say, have you lost your mind? They didn't have this back then. And so that's just a lot of work. And you have a degree in history, Jayne?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Does that
that's
help?
it. It actually kept me out of writing historicals for years
Good.
because I knew enough about research to be intimidated by by it.
Mhm.
Um, but Yeah, but it ultimately that and the library career is probably what really gave me the tools for research. But a real handy tip for dealing with if you're going to write a movie set or a book set in the 40s or the 30s or even the 50s, whatever era you pick, start with the movies because little things in the movies you don't even think about, like whether or not you could. I ran into this thing in the 30s, like, could you take a telephone call outside by the pool at the Beverly Hilton? Little stuff like
Nope.
that.
Yeah.
And and I'm watching this movie, and there they are. They take the phone out and plug it in. It's like, oh,
I was gonna
okay.
say, how do you research that? Yeah, that's a good point.
That's pretty
But the
awesome.
movies are fabulous. And there's another movie with Clark Gable and in which there's this what we would call one of those little helicopter things, a one-person helicopter thing in it. Who would have thought, that somebody out there was using a one-person helicopter in the 1930s, so kind of a rocket thing. And there it was in the movie. And it was like, oh, okay.
How do you know that's not just a movie convention and that it really existed then? Do you have to do research after the movie?
No, I don't worry about it. If it showed up in the movies and the movies are still around,
You're
it's
gonna
legit.
use it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess if they were treating it as fictional, I would treat it as fictional. But I mean, you know what you're watching. If you're watching a romantic comedy, they're not going to throw in a mummy. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, yeah, one way or another. Anyhow, that's my tip for the day is start with the movies and get a feel for the dialogue, the language, how relationships between the sexes work, that kind of thing.
Mm.
I kind of like this idea of romantic comedy with a mummy now. I'm gonna write that one down because
Can't go
that
wrong
sounds
with
like a
movies.
good story idea.
I was going to say that if anybody can write it, it's going to be Jayne.
You're right.
Okay, so last question. We're just about out of time. It's from Tyler. Annelise, what was your favorite part of writing Beasts of the North Woods?
Um, Probably being out in the Chequamegon National Forest after I learned how to pronounce that at night and seeing just how dark it was, even with moonlight, hearing all the noises, because I do believe in doing real honest to God research for my books. If I'm going to write a character who's out in the woods at night in the Chequamegon National Forest, then I need to go out and be in there at nighttime. And it was cold, it was scary, but it was also very exciting, very fun, and very beautiful and peaceful. And so I think that was probably my favorite part of that. That and this, and yeah, I can't say what the other part was because it'll give away the plot, but part of the plot. But there, yeah, some of the research I did was also quite fun. And Bayfield, Wisconsin, if anybody has never been there, I absolutely recommend that you visit Bayfield, Wisconsin. It is a beautiful little town on Lake Superior. It has a fantastic little bistro. The bistro that's in the book is real. So that was my favorite thing, was just being in Bayfield.
Before I get to you, Jayne, for that last question, the chat has really enjoying that mummy love type of thing. So, make it happen. Maria wants to know if a zombie can love a mummy. Of course, zombies love their mummies as much as the rest of us. Um, so yes, final question for you, Jayne. What was your favorite part of writing Shattering Dawn?
I think it's what we talked about earlier. It's that when I got toward the end, I realized everything I needed was there. I just hadn't seen it. And I got the answers. It's scary to write that way, as we both know. But when I got to the end, I suddenly realized everything fell into place very neatly. In a way I can't say either, because there goes the plot. There goes the spoilers. But that feels good as you get into the story and you find that now you get I guess you get the vision of the book, and then
there was one character that I was very glad turned out the way they did, and that's all I'm going to say.
And there's a dog in your book.
Oh yes, there's always dogs in my books.
Can't go wrong with a dog.
You have dogs. Jayne has dead bodies. It's all good.
Mine is sitting right here beside me this whole time. So, and we're getting a new puppy tomorrow.
Exciting.
Yeah, exciting and crazy.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I've learned a lot, and Jayne, even though I've been reading you for many, many years, I feel like I can always learn something more from you. There's always more. So I just love it. And Annelise, your books sound amazing. Beasts of the Northwoods was really, I got an arc of it. It was wonderful. And
thank you.
Creepy in a Wisconsin type of way. I appreciate that, though. So thank you again for taking the time to talk with us tonight. And Jayne's book just came out. Annelise's book is coming out at the end of this month. Make sure you check them out. And of course, they'll have more books in the future, which we can't wait to read. Thank you all for being here with us and for your great conversation. I really enjoyed the chat and all of your questions.
Oh, this was great.
Thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks for having us, Mina.
Yes.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thanks.